Money speaks, but true wealth listens. Richard Jasson thought he was the most powerful man in the room when he scrawled a humiliating note on a $4,800 dinner check, deliberately crossing out the tip line before tossing the leather folder at the quiet waitress. He believed he was teaching a brutal life lesson to someone fundamentally beneath him. He didn't know that the woman patiently clearing his empty Wagyu steak plate wasn't just trying to make rent. She was Samantha Hayes, the ruthless private equity titan who, just 3 hours prior, had silently finalized the hostile takeover of his entire corporate empire. The ambient lighting inside Le Petit Manoir was designed to make its patrons look flawlessly wealthy. Nestled in the heart of Manhattan's Upper East Side, the Michelin-starred French establishment was less of a restaurant and more of a private sanctuary for the city's financial elite. The crystal chandeliers dropped a soft, honeyed glow over tables draped in heavy, flawless white linen. The air smelled faintly of black truffles, aged oak, and exorbitant success. Samantha Hayes adjusted the crisp black apron tied around her waist. Her dark hair was pulled back into a severe, utilitarian bun, entirely devoid of the styling that normally accompanied her public appearances. Tonight, she was invisible. That was exactly the point. Most billionaires hired auditors or shadow shoppers to evaluate their newly acquired assets. Samantha, the managing partner of Hayes Whitmore Capital, preferred to bleed in the trenches. When her firm purchased the Grand Oak Hospitality Group, a portfolio of 12 ultra-luxury restaurants, she instituted a personal policy. Once a quarter, she worked a Friday night dinner shift incognito. It was the only way to see where the rot lived, to understand the operational inefficiencies that spreadsheets couldn't capture, and to observe how the clientele truly behaved. "Table 4 is yours, Sam," whispered Gerard, the notoriously high-strung maitre d', who was one of the only 3 people in the building aware that the quiet woman carrying water pitchers was essentially his supreme commander. He looked visibly pale. "It's Richard Jasson, CEO of Jasson Logistics. He's a difficult guest. He arrived demanding the corner booth and has already sent back his sparkling water twice because the bubbles weren't aggressive enough." Samantha offered a serene, almost predatory smile. "Don't worry, Gerard. I can handle difficult." She picked up a silver tray bearing 2 fresh glasses of Baccarat crystal and a bottle of vintage champagne gliding seamlessly across the dining room floor. At table 4 sat Richard Jasson. He was a man in his late 50s, his face flushed with a mixture of expensive gin and inherent high blood pressure. He wore a bespoke navy suit that fit well, but he wore it aggressively, leaning back in his chair with his legs sprawled. On his left wrist, a heavy, diamond-encrusted Audemars Piguet watch caught the chandelier light, a loud, desperate beacon of new money. Across from him sat Arthur Pendleton, his chief operating officer, a thin man who looked perpetually terrified, nodding vigorously at whatever Richard was saying. "I'm telling you, Arthur, they are begging me," Richard boomed, his voice carrying just a fraction too loudly for the refined, hushed tones of the room. "These private equity vultures think they can swoop in and rattle my cage. But I built Jasson Logistics from a fleet of 6 rusted trucks into a $500 supply chain juggernaut. They want the keys to the kingdom? They're going to pay the iron price. My golden parachute alone is going to buy me a private island off the coast of Belize." Samantha approached the table, her posture impeccably deferential. "Good evening, gentlemen. Your champagne, as requested." Richard didn't even look up at her. He simply raised his hand, 2 fingers extended, expecting the glass to be placed perfectly within his grasp, without breaking his conversation. "And I told their lawyers," Richard continued, completely ignoring Samantha as she poured the golden liquid. "I told them, you want to keep my proprietary routing software? You keep me on the board. Period. I'm indispensable." "Absolutely, Richard. You are the company," Arthur simpered, taking a nervous sip of his drink. "Excuse me," Richard snapped suddenly, his eyes finally snapping to Samantha. The warmth in his voice vanished, replaced by a chilling, aristocratic annoyance. "What are you doing?" Samantha paused, the neck of the champagne bottle hovering an inch above his glass. "Pouring your champagne, sir." "You filled it past the midpoint of the crest," Richard sneered, pointing a thick finger at the subtle engraving on the crystal. "Are you new here? Do you know what a bottle of Salon 2002 costs? It needs to breathe. You don't fill it like it's cheap draft beer at a sports bar. Take it away. Bring me a fresh glass, and try to use whatever minimal intelligence you possess this time." Arthur looked down at his lap, visibly embarrassed. Samantha's expression remained perfectly composed. Behind her dark eyes, a highly advanced supercomputer was instantly recalculating Richard Jasson's corporate worth. Arrogant, lacks emotional intelligence, abusive to subordinates. He's going to be a liability to the board, she thought. "My apologies, Mr. Jasson," Samantha said, her voice smooth and devoid of any sarcasm. "I will correct that immediately." "See that you do," Richard muttered, turning back to Arthur. "Good help is a myth in this city. You pay $4,000 for a meal, and they send out a high school dropout to pour the wine." Samantha turned and walked back toward the service station. She didn't feel angry. A lion doesn't feel angry when a gazelle boasts about how fast it can run. She felt a deep, profound sense of anticipation. The dinner dragged on for 2 excruciating hours. Samantha navigated Richard Jasson's demands with the precision of a seasoned diplomat in a war zone. She endured his snapping fingers, his condescending sighs, and his incessant need to remind everyone in a 10-foot radius about his impending multi-million-dollar buyout. He sent the seared foie gras back because the brioche toast was too rustic. He complained that the truffles shaved over his risotto lacked earthy vigor. Through it all, Samantha nodded, apologized, and provided flawless service. As the evening approached 11 o'clock, the dining room began to empty, leaving only the stragglers and the truly dedicated drinkers. Richard had ordered a bottle of Louis XIII cognac to finish the night. Just as Samantha approached to clear the dessert plates, Richard's cell phone buzzed violently against the mahogany table. He snatched it up, checking the caller ID. A wide, predatory grin split his face. "It's the lawyers," he whispered harshly to Arthur. "It's done. The ink is dry. Hayes Whitmore just wired the escrow." Richard answered the phone, pressing it to his ear. "Tell me we are officially obscenely rich, Thomas." Samantha stood a few feet away, her back turned as she arranged silverware on a tray, but she listened intently. Thomas was Thomas Vance. Wait, no, Thomas Callahan, Richard's lead counsel. Samantha knew this because she had been the one to authorize the wire transfer from a secure server in her penthouse just hours before putting on this apron. "Yes," Richard said into the phone, his voice dripping with triumphant satisfaction. "And the board seat? Good. I told you they wouldn't dare push me out completely. I'm the face of the brand. Let these corporate suits play with their spreadsheets. I run the floor. Excellent. See you at the signing tomorrow at 9. He hung up the phone and slammed his hand on the table, causing the heavy crystal glasses to shudder. "Arthur, it's over. We did it. I am officially untouchable." He snapped his fingers in Samantha's direction. "You, waitress, the check. Now, and don't dawdle, I have a city to buy." "Right away, sir," Samantha said. She walked to the POS terminal. The total came to $4,820.50, a staggering sum for a Tuesday night dinner for two, mostly inflated by the rare vintage wines and the cognac. She printed the itemized receipt, slipped it into the sleek black leather folio, and walked it over to the table, placing it gently next to Richard's elbow. Richard didn't even look at the bill. He pulled a heavy metallic black card from his money clip and dropped it onto the leather. "Run it." Samantha processed the card and returned with the slips to be signed. She placed a heavy silver pen on top of the folio. "Take your time, sir. Whenever you are ready." Richard pulled the folio toward him. He looked at the total, giving a small, arrogant scoff. He then looked up at Samantha, his eyes scanning her simple uniform, her tired posture, which she was expertly faking, and her plain, makeup-free face. "You know," Richard said, swirling the last drop of his cognac, "you've been hovering around us all night, listening in. I know you people do that, hoping to catch a stock tip or something that will miraculously pull you out of your miserable tax bracket." Arthur shifted uncomfortably. "Richard, maybe we should just—" "Quiet, Arthur," Richard snapped. He looked back at Samantha. "I'm a self-made man. I built an empire because I understand value. I understand what things are worth. You brought me water, you brought me plates, and you managed to mess up pouring a simple glass of wine. What value did you add to my night?" Samantha looked at him, her expression perfectly blank. "I endeavor to provide a seamless dining experience, sir." "Seamless," Richard mocked. He clicked the silver pen. "In the real world, compensation is tied to excellence. You are mediocre. You are a cog in a machine." He looked down at the receipt. On the tip line, he drew a thick, aggressive line straight through it. Down in the total line, he rewrote the exact amount. $4,820.50. Then, at the bottom of the merchant copy, he wrote a note. He wrote it slowly, ensuring the letters were dark and legible. He closed the folio and pushed it toward her. "Here's a tip that's worth more than 20%, Richard said, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "Read it and take it to heart." He stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. "Let's go, Arthur. I can't breathe in here anymore." Samantha stood completely still as the two men walked out of the restaurant, the heavy glass doors closing behind them with a muted thud. Gerard, the maitre d', rushed over, his face flushed with indignation. "Miss Hayes, I am so sorry. I should have intervened. He is a monster. Please let me comp his check. I'll void it right now." "No, Gerard," Samantha said softly. "Process it exactly as he wrote it." She opened the leather folio. There, written in bold, slashing black ink, were the words, "Here's a tip. Get a real career." Gerard looked over her shoulder and gasped. The sheer audacity. He left nothing on almost $5,000. "Miss Hayes, you don't have to tolerate this." Samantha didn't look angry. Instead, a slow, genuine smile spread across her face. It was the smile of a chess grandmaster who had just watched her opponent move his queen directly into a trap. "Oh, Gerard," Samantha whispered, gently closing the leather book. "I'm going to frame this receipt. And I promise you, by tomorrow morning, Mr. Jason is going to learn exactly what my real career entails." She untied her apron, draped it neatly over a chair, and pulled her cell phone from her pocket. She dialed her executive vice president, David Cole. "David," she said, her voice shifting instantly from the soft tones of a subservient waitress to the razor-sharp cadence of a CEO. "Change of plans for the Jason Logistics acquisition tomorrow. I'm personally attending the final signing." "Sam?" David's confused voice crackled through the speaker. "I thought you were letting legal handle the handshake. You never attend the closing ceremonies." "I've made an exception," Samantha replied, her eyes lingering on the empty table 4. And David? Have corporate draft an immediate termination clause for the CEO position. Complete severance of his board seat, effective upon my signature. Nullify the consultancy agreement. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Sam, that's going to trigger a hostile exit protocol. He's going to lose millions in ongoing stock options. I know, Samantha said coldly. He doesn't understand value. I think it's time someone taught him. The headquarters of Jason Logistics occupied the top 3 floors of a sleek, glass and steel skyscraper in the financial district. On this particular Wednesday morning, the atmosphere on the executive floor was electric. The scent of fresh, imported coffee and expensive leather permeated the air. Richard Jason stood at the head of the massive obsidian conference table, looking like a king surveying his conquered lands. He wore a brand-new charcoal grey Brioni suit, specifically selected for the press photos that would undoubtedly follow the final ink drying on the contract. Around the table sat a small army of lawyers and executives. On Richard's side were his loyalists, including Arthur Pendleton, who looked slightly hungover from the previous night's celebrations, but was dutifully holding a stack of leather-bound dossiers. Opposite them sat the acquisition team from Hayes Whitmore Capital. David Cole, Samantha's right-hand man, sat quietly in a tailored navy suit, checking his Rolex. "So, David," Richard said loudly, leaning over the table and resting his knuckles on the dark wood. "Where is the Phantom Leader? We've been negotiating this buyout for 6 months, and I've yet to meet the puppet master. Is Mr. Hayes going to grace us with his presence today?" David looked up, his expression unreadable. "First of all, Richard, there is no Mr. Hayes. The founder passed away a decade ago. The firm is run by his daughter, and yes, our managing partner is on her way up the private elevator as we speak. She specifically requested to be here to finalize your transition." Richard scoffed, waving a hand dismissively. "A daughter. Great. Another trust fund kid playing with daddy's money. Well, make sure she brings a good pen. Once this is signed, I expect full autonomy over the logistics division. As per the agreement, I retain my title, my corner office, and my board seat. I report only to the executive committee." David adjusted his glasses. "The contract terms are subject to final approval by the managing partner." "The terms are locked, David," Richard growled, his face reddening. "If she tries to renegotiate my parachute now, I'll walk out of here and tank the deal. The press will have a field day." "I assure you, Richard," David said calmly, "she has no intention of renegotiating the price of the company." Just then, the heavy, frosted glass doors of the boardroom clicked open. The low murmur of the room instantly died down. First came 2 security personnel, who stepped aside to hold the doors. Then, she walked in. Samantha Hayes was no longer wearing a black apron and sensible, non-slip shoes. Today, she was armored in a $5,000 tailored Tom Ford pantsuit in a striking deep maroon. Her dark hair was blown out in sleek, powerful waves that framed a face devoid of the soft, deferential expressions she had worn the night before. She carried a slim, black leather briefcase. Her heels clicked against the hardwood floor with a rhythmic, terrifying finality. She walked directly toward the empty leather chair at the head of the table, directly opposite Richard. Arthur Pendleton, who was taking a sip of water, suddenly choked. He slammed his glass down, coughing violently, his eyes bulging as he stared at the woman walking into the room. Richard, however, was facing the window, adjusting his cuffs. He turned around slowly with a patronizing smile. "Ah, the mysterious Miss Hayes. A pleasure to finally—" Richard's voice died in his throat. The color drained from his face so rapidly, he looked as though he might faint. His jaw slackened, his eyes darting from the impeccable tailoring of her suit to the sharp, dark eyes that had, just 10 hours ago, asked him if he wanted his sparkling water chilled. The room fell into a suffocating, deathly silence. The only sound was the low hum of the air conditioning. Samantha stood behind her chair. She didn't sit down. She simply placed her briefcase on the table and looked directly at Richard. She let the silence stretch, forcing him to drown in it. "Good morning, Mr. Jasson," Samantha said. Her voice was the exact same smooth, controlled cadence as the night before, but stripped of all subservience. It was cold steel. Richard opened his mouth, but only a dry, rattling breath came out. He looked wildly at Arthur, who was staring at his shoes, practically vibrating with panic. He looked at David Cole, who looked thoroughly entertained. "You!" Richard stammered, his booming bravado completely shattered. He pointed a trembling finger at her. You were the waitress?" Samantha finished for him, raising a singular eyebrow. "Yes. I am also the owner of Le Petit Manoir, the entirety of the Grand Oak Hospitality Group, and, as of a few wire transfers this morning, I am the owner of you." Richard gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. This is a joke. A setup. You spied on me." "I served you," Samantha corrected sharply. "I provided you with an impeccable dining experience, and in return, you provided me with a highly valuable, unvarnished look into your character, your leadership style, and your fundamental understanding of worth." She reached into her sleek briefcase. She didn't pull out the massive 300-page contract. Instead, she pulled out a small, singular piece of paper, encased in a clear plastic sleeve. She slid it across the long, polished table. It glided smoothly, coming to a stop directly in front of Richard. It was the merchant copy of the restaurant receipt from the night before. The total of $4,820.50 was written clearly, and at the bottom, in Richard's own aggressive handwriting, "Here's a tip. Get a real career." Richard stared at the receipt as if it were a venomous snake. "I took your advice, Richard," Samantha said, her voice dropping an octave, ringing with absolute authority. "I evaluated my career, and I realized that as the managing partner of this firm, I have a fiduciary duty to my investors to eliminate toxic, arrogant, and fundamentally destructive liabilities from my newly acquired assets." Richard's chest heaved. "You can't do this. We have an agreement. I have a board seat. I am indispensable." Samantha looked to David Cole. David nodded and slid a thin, red folder across the table to Richard's lead counsel, Thomas Callahan. "Thomas," David said calmly, "you'll find the revised addendums. As per Clause 4B of the Acquisition Protocol, the purchasing entity reserves the right to terminate the current CEO immediately upon final signing, with cause, nullifying all future consultancy fees, unvested stock options, and board privileges." Thomas opened the folder, quickly scanning the legal text. He looked up at Richard, his face grim. "Richard, she can do this. The severance package is completely gutted. They are buying the company, but they are severing your contract entirely." "No!" Richard shouted, slamming his hand on the table, just as he had done the night before. But this time, it didn't look powerful. It looked pathetic. "I built this company. You need me." "I need your trucks," Samantha said coldly. "I need your routing software. I need your warehouse infrastructure. What I absolutely do not need is a man whose ego is so fragile, he has to verbally abuse hospitality staff to feel important." She picked up a heavy silver pen, an exact replica of the one Richard had used the night before, and uncapped it. "You told me last night that in the real world, compensation is tied to excellence," Samantha said, her eyes boring into his. You told me I was mediocre. Well, Richard, I've audited your leadership. Your turnover rate in middle management is abysmal. Your corporate culture is terrified of you. You are, by every metric that matters to me, a mediocre leader." She signed the master document on her side of the table with a swift, fluid motion. "Your buyout for the physical assets is secure," Samantha concluded, closing the folder. "You will be a wealthy man. But as of this exact second, you no longer work here. You have no office, you have no authority, and you have no career in my company." She paused, leaning forward slightly. "Here's a tip, Richard. Have your desk cleared out by noon." For a full 10 seconds, the boardroom was suspended in a vacuum of absolute disbelief. Richard Jasson, a man who had spent the last 2 decades terrifying dock workers, bullying competitors, and treating his corporate staff like indentured servants, looked as though he had been physically struck. He looked at Thomas Callahan, his high-priced bulldog of an attorney, expecting legal hellfire to rain down upon Samantha Hayes. But Thomas was already meticulously packing his briefcases. "Thomas!" Richard barked, the sound desperate and hollow. "Do something. File an injunction. Claim breach of good faith. She can't just walk in here and decapitate me on the day of the signing." Thomas sighed, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. He didn't look at Richard. He looked at the signed contract. "Richard, the ink is on the paper. You signed the master asset transfer yesterday afternoon, which authorized the escrow release. The operational handover clause, the one we argued about, the one you insisted was just boilerplate corporate restructuring language, gave Hayes Whitmore Capital the right to dissolve the executive board upon completion of the financial transfer. She didn't breach the contract. She executed it. But my severance, my stock options." Richard stepped toward the table, his face a mottled, furious red. "Tied to a termination without cause clause," David Cole interjected smoothly from across the table, tapping the red folder. "Miss Hayes just fired you with cause. Gross unprofessionalism, creation of a hostile corporate environment, and documented abuse of service personnel while representing the company, which violates the moral turpitude clause of your employment agreement." "A waitress!" Richard screamed, the veneer of the sophisticated billionaire shattering entirely. He pointed a shaking, furious finger at Samantha. "You are terminating a $100 million executive package over a glorified maid." "I am terminating a liability," Samantha corrected, her voice carrying the icy chill of a winter storm. She hadn't moved an inch, her posture radiating an impenetrable calm that only infuriated Richard further. "A CEO who treats the working class with such visceral contempt is a CEO who fundamentally misunderstands the backbone of a logistics company. Your drivers, your warehouse packers, your dispatchers, they are the people you mocked last night. You don't respect them. Therefore, you cannot lead them." Richard sneered, leaning heavily against the back of his chair. "You think you know this business because you read a balance sheet? Jasson Logistics runs on blood and sweat. It runs on loyalty to me. If you throw me out that door, the entire network will collapse by Friday. The union bosses won't talk to a trust fund equity vampire. You are going to beg me to come back." Samantha finally sat down in the leather chair at the head of the table. It was a subtle, devastating transfer of power. "Arthur," she said quietly, shifting her gaze to the perpetually terrified Chief Operating Officer. Arthur Pendleton jumped as if he had been electrocuted. "Yes, Miss Hayes. You've been running the day-to-day operations for the last 4 years while Mr. Jasson here took 3-hour lunches at Le Petit Manoir," Samantha stated, reading from a mental dossier. "I've reviewed the internal communications. You are the one the regional managers actually report to." Is that correct?" Arthur swallowed hard, his eyes darting to Richard, who was glaring at him with pure venom, and then back to the billionaire sitting at the head of the table. Survival instinct, honed by years of corporate abuse, kicked in. "Yes, ma'am," Arthur said, his voice gaining a fraction of confidence. "I handle the operational logistics and union liaisons." "Excellent," Samantha smiled, a genuine, terrifyingly bright smile. "Effective immediately, you are the interim CEO of Jason Logistics. Your salary is doubled, and your bonus structure is now tied to retention, not just aggressive expansion. I expect a full briefing on the East Coast supply chain bottlenecks by 4 o'clock. Arthur's jaw dropped. He looked at Richard, the man he had cowered behind for years, and then straightened his tie. "I will have that on your desk by 3:30, Miss Hayes." Richard let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "Arthur? You're giving the keys to Arthur? You traitor! You spineless little—" "Security," Samantha said, not raising her voice, but pitching it perfectly to carry to the two large men standing by the frosted glass doors. They stepped forward instantly. "Mr. Jason's access fob has been deactivated," Samantha instructed them. "Please escort him to his former office so he may collect his personal effects. Only family photos and personal desk items. No company laptops, no hard drives, no physical files. Then escort him to the lobby. If he is seen on the premises after 12 noon, call the police and have him arrested for trespassing." Richard stood frozen. The reality of the situation was crashing down on him with the weight of a derailed freight train. He wasn't just losing his company. He was being humiliated, systematically dismantled in front of the very people he had tormented. "You haven't heard the last of this, Samantha," Richard spat, using her first name in a pathetic attempt to reclaim some semblance of dominance. "I built this. I can break it." Samantha picked up the plastic-sleeved receipt with his insulting handwritten tip, sliding it back into her briefcase. "Have a wonderful retirement, Richard. I hear Belize is beautiful this time of year. Try not to insult the Cabana boys." As the security guards flanked him, gently but firmly grasping his biceps, Richard Jason, the former king of logistics, was marched out of his own boardroom. The silence that followed his departure was heavy, thick with the smell of new beginnings and the unmistakable scent of absolute victory. 2 days later, Richard Jason was pacing the length of his massive, vaulted study in his Connecticut mansion. The room was aggressively masculine, filled with dark mahogany, leather-bound books he had never read, and the mounting smell of expensive, desperate scotch. He had spent 48 hours oscillating between blinding rage and a nauseating hollow panic. The financial press had caught wind of his abrupt departure. While Hayes Whitmore Capital released a sanitized statement about Richard stepping down to pursue personal philanthropy, the whispers on Wall Street were vicious. The stock of the newly acquired logistics division had actually surged by 4% upon the news of his ousting. That was the deepest cut. The market didn't mourn him. It celebrated his execution. Richard poured himself another 3 fingers of Macallan. He stared at his phone, resting on the desk like an unexploded bomb. He couldn't let her win. He couldn't let a waitress-playing billionaire strip him of his legacy and install his sycophantic lapdog, Arthur, in his place. He needed to prove to the board, to the market, and to Samantha Hayes that Jason Logistics was nothing without its namesake. He snatched the phone and dialed a number he knew by heart. "Yeah?" A gruff voice answered on the 3rd ring. "Bradley," Richard said, leaning against his desk, his voice dropping into the conspiratorial growl he used for backroom deals. Bradley Henderson was the head of regional dispatch for the entire mid-Atlantic sector. He was a coarse, aggressive man, cut from the exact same cloth as Richard. More importantly, Bradley was fiercely loyal to Richard, mostly because Richard looked the other way when Bradley padded his expense reports and awarded lucrative maintenance contracts to his brother-in-law's auto shop. "Mr. Jason," Bradley said, his tone shifting. "Man, it's a graveyard down here without you. Pendleton is running around like a headless chicken, asking for efficiency metrics. It's a joke. What the hell happened?" "Corporate raiding, Brad," Richard lied smoothly. "They forced me out. They want to gut the company, sell off the trucks, and automate your dispatchers out of a job. They are coming for you next." A heavy silence fell over the line. "The hell they are. We run this coast." "Exactly," Richard smiled, a cruel, vindictive spark returning to his eyes. "Which is why we need to show them exactly who holds the power. I still have buyers lined up, Bradley. Caldwell Freight is watching this transition closely. If Hayes Whitmore fumbles the ball this week, the board will panic, the stock will tank, and I can step back in with a hostile counteroffer. But I need the network to bleed." "What do you need me to do, boss?" Bradley asked, the loyalty practically dripping from the receiver. "Tomorrow is Friday, the end-of-month push. I want a wildcat strike," Richard commanded. "Nothing official on paper, just a sudden, mysterious flu, sweeping through the primary driver pool at the Newark and Philadelphia hubs. I want 70% of the fleet grounded by 6 a.m. I want cold chain shipments rotting on the docks. I want Arthur Pendleton crying on the phone to his new boss because he can't move a single pallet of perishable goods." Bradley chuckled, a low, ugly sound. "A coordinated sick-out. I like it. The union reps owe me a few favors anyway. We'll paralyze the eastern seaboard by breakfast." "Make it hurt, Brad," Richard whispered, taking a long sip of his scotch. "Let's see how well Miss Hayes handles a real crisis." He hung up the phone, feeling the intoxicating rush of control flood back into his veins. Samantha Hayes might have the paperwork, but Richard had the streets. Tomorrow, she would learn that you can't manage a blue-collar empire from a penthouse suite. She would be forced to call him. She would have to beg. At 5:45 a.m. the next morning, the central dispatch hub of Jason Logistics in downtown Manhattan was a scene of controlled chaos. The massive, wall-to-wall digital map of the East Coast, usually a steady stream of moving green dots representing active freight, was blinking with an alarming number of stationary red icons. Arthur Pendleton was sweating through his shirt, a phone pressed to each ear. "What do you mean 50 drivers called out in Newark? Food poisoning? All of them? I don't care. Get the reserve roster on the line." The heavy steel doors of the dispatch center hissed open. Samantha Hayes walked in. She was flanked by David Cole and 3 serious-looking men carrying encrypted laptops. She was dressed in a simple, sharp black turtleneck and slacks, holding a steaming cup of black coffee. She didn't look like a CEO checking on a crisis. She looked like a general arriving at a war room she had entirely anticipated. The room fell silent as she bypassed the panicked middle managers and walked directly to Arthur's central terminal. "Good morning, Arthur," Samantha said calmly, taking a sip of her coffee. "I see Mr. Henderson is executing his sick-out right on schedule." Arthur dropped his phones, staring at her in shock. You knew about this?" "I bought a logistics company, Arthur, not a lemonade stand," Samantha replied, her eyes scanning the sea of red dots on the digital map. "When you excise a tumor like Richard Jason, you have to expect the surrounding infected tissue to act up. Bradley Henderson is a known loyalist. It was highly probable Richard would attempt to leverage him to artificially tank our operational capacity and prove his indispensability." She turned to David Cole. "David, status on the secondary fleet?" "Ready to deploy, Sam," David said, opening his laptop. "We successfully finalized the short-term lease agreement with Caldwell Freight last night at 11 p.m. They've provided 75 drivers and cabs to cover the Newark and Philly deficits. The cold chain shipments are already being rerouted to their docks." Arthur looked as though he might faint from relief. You partnered with Caldwell? They are our biggest regional competitor." "They were our competitor," Samantha corrected gently, "until I bought a 15% controlling stake in their parent company 3 weeks ago as a contingency plan for this exact scenario. It pays to diversify your portfolio, Arthur." She placed her coffee cup down and turned to one of the IT specialists she had brought with her. "Patch me through to Bradley Henderson's private office line. Put it on the overhead speakers." The specialist typed rapidly, and a moment later, the ringing tone echoed through the massive room. It picked up on the second ring. "Yeah, talk to me." Bradley's smug voice echoed from the ceiling. "Tell me Pendleton is weeping." "Mr. Henderson," Samantha's voice sliced through the air, cool and metallic. "This is Samantha Hayes. I am the managing partner of Hayes Whitmore Capital, and as of Wednesday, your supreme employer." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Miss Hayes, we have a situation down here. Terrible flu bug going around. Unavoidable, really." "Save the performance, Bradley. It's entirely unnecessary," Samantha interrupted. "I am currently watching the GPS telemetrics. I know exactly what you are doing, and I'm calling to offer you a very simple choice." "A choice?" Bradley asked, his bravado wavering. "Yes. Option A. You call your union reps, you cure this miraculous flu within the next 20 minutes, and you get my trucks back on the road. If you do this, I will allow you to resign gracefully on Monday morning with a standard severance package, and we will part ways." "Or," Bradley challenged, trying to sound tough, "because you can't fire the whole hub, lady. You have no proof I orchestrated anything." Samantha offered a terrifyingly serene smile to the room. "Option B. I terminate you right now, for cause, and then I hand over the forensic accounting file I had my team compile during our acquisition audit to the federal authorities. Specifically, the file detailing the inflated invoices you've been approving for Henderson Auto Repair, which, interestingly, is owned by your brother-in-law, totaling nearly $1.2 million in embezzled corporate funds over the last 3 years. The silence on the line was so absolute, it felt as though the call had dropped. Even Arthur Pendleton gasped, covering his mouth. "I have the wire transfers, Bradley," Samantha continued, her voice soft but completely lethal. "I have the forged maintenance logs. I know Richard Jasson turned a blind eye to it in exchange for your absolute loyalty. But Richard is gone, and I do not tolerate thieves in my house." Bradley's voice was barely a squeak. The aggressive union boss had evaporated, replaced by a terrified man staring down the barrel of a federal indictment. 20 minutes, Bradley," Samantha stated, checking her sleek platinum watch. "If those trucks aren't moving by 6:15 a.m., my lawyers will be dialing the district attorney at 6:16. Make your choice." She motioned to the IT specialist, who abruptly cut the connection. Samantha turned back to the massive digital map. She picked up her coffee, perfectly unbothered. "Arthur," she said casually, "get the dock managers ready. The fleet is about to move." Exactly 14 minutes later, the stationary red dots on the map began to flicker. One by one, then in clusters of 10 and 20, they turned a brilliant, moving green. The strike was broken before the sun had even fully risen over the Manhattan skyline. Samantha watched the green dots flow out of Newark, like blood returning to a vital organ. She had surgically removed the rot, anticipated the infection, and cured the system without breaking a sweat. Richard Jasson wanted a war. He didn't realize he had challenged a woman who owned the entire battlefield. 3 weeks had passed since the hostile takeover of Jasson Logistics and the subsequent humiliating decapitation of its founder. In the corporate world, 3 weeks was an eternity. Under the interim leadership of Arthur Pendleton, guided by the ruthless, calculating hand of Samantha Hayes, the company had not only stabilized, but thrived. The removal of Richard Jasson's toxic micromanagement had uncorked years of suppressed efficiency. Drivers were happier, dispatchers were breathing easier, and the stock price had climbed a steady 8%. But Richard Jasson was a man violently allergic to defeat. He had spent the last 21 days leveraging every favor, calling in every debt, and dining with every venture capitalist who would still return his calls. He was bleeding money on retainers for crisis PR firms and aggressive defense attorneys. But he didn't care. He was fueled by a singular, burning obsession: the complete and utter destruction of Samantha Hayes. His grand comeback was scheduled for the annual Maritime and Logistics Vanguard Gala, held in the breathtaking Grand Ballroom of the Pierre Hotel on Fifth Avenue. It was the undisputed networking event of the year for the East Coast supply chain elite. Anyone who moved millions of tons of freight across the Atlantic was in that room. Richard had managed to secure a ticket through an old golfing buddy, Harrison Croft, the aging chairman of a mid-sized shipping conglomerate. Richard arrived wrapped in a pristine Tom Ford tuxedo, his jaw set, his eyes darting around the room with the frantic energy of a cornered predator. He had a pitch deck saved on his phone and a desperate plan: secure $50 million in seed capital for Jasson Global, a rival startup designed specifically to poach Hayes Whitmore's top clients. "You need to relax, Richard," Harrison muttered, sipping his gin martini as they stood near a towering ice sculpture of a cargo ship. "You're sweating through your silk, and frankly, half the room is staring at you. The rumors about your exit, they aren't pretty." "Let them stare," Richard growled, adjusting his bow tie with trembling fingers. "They're sheep. They read a sanitized press release and think they know the truth. I built this industry. When I announce my new venture tonight, I'll have investors lining up at the bar. I just need to corner William Ashford." William Ashford was the white whale. He was the billionaire head of Ashford Trans Global, a private equity mammoth that rivaled Hayes Whitmore. If Richard could secure Ashford's backing, it would be a very public, very bloody declaration of war against Samantha. Richard spotted the silver-haired billionaire holding court near the head table. Taking a deep breath, Richard plastered on his trademark, booming smile and strode across the plush carpet, leaving Harrison behind. "Bill!" Richard projected, clapping a heavy hand on the shoulder of a nearby executive to move him out of the way. "Bill Ashford! My God, it's been too long. You're looking incredibly well. Tell me you aren't still playing that dreadful slice on the back nine at Augusta." William Ashford turned slowly. He was a man of old, quiet money. He looked at Richard's extended hand for a long, agonizing second before briefly shaking it. The temperature in the immediate vicinity seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Richard," William said, his tone perfectly neutral, "I was surprised to see your name on the guest list. I understood you were transitioning into a quiet retirement." "Retirement is for the weak, Bill," Richard laughed, the sound slightly too loud, slightly too desperate. "A minor restructuring, a difference of vision with the new buyers. You know how these trust fund equity kids are. They read a spreadsheet and think they can run a fleet. I'm actually launching something new, leaner, faster. I'd love to get you on the ground floor. 50 million buys you a 40% stake in the future." William Ashford stared at him. He didn't blink. "You are pitching me a startup at a charity gala, Richard." "I'm pitching you an empire." Richard doubled down, stepping closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The infrastructure at my old shop is already crumbling under that woman. I know the clients. I know the routes. We can bleed them dry in 6 months." Before William could respond, a subtle shift occurred in the atmosphere of the grand ballroom. The low hum of 100 simultaneous conversations began to taper off, replaced by a wave of hushed murmurs. Heads turned toward the massive, gilded mahogany doors at the entrance. The string quartet playing softly in the corner seemed to fade into the background. Samantha Hayes had arrived. She did not enter with a booming voice or a desperate need to be noticed. She simply commanded the space. She wore an exquisite, floor-length midnight blue gown that flowed like liquid silk, devoid of heavy jewelry or ostentatious branding. Her dark hair was styled in an elegant, sweeping updo. She moved with the effortless, terrifying grace of an apex predator inspecting her territory. Flanked by David Cole and Arthur Pendleton, who was looking remarkably dignified and confident in a tailored tuxedo of his own, Samantha began to navigate the room. Industry titans, men who had previously dismissed her as a phantom entity, practically fell over themselves to greet her, offer their congratulations, and pay their respects to the woman who had surgically removed the loudest man in logistics. Richard watched her, his vision tinting red. The sheer audacity of her presence, looking completely at ease in his world, among his peers, made the bile rise in his throat. "Ah," William Ashford said, a genuine, warm smile finally breaking across his face as he looked past Richard's shoulder. "The woman of the hour. Excuse me, Richard." William stepped neatly around Richard and extended both hands toward Samantha as she approached. "Samantha, my dear, flawless timing as always. Congratulations on the acquisition. A masterstroke. Wall Street is still trying to figure out how you kept the union so quiet during the transition." "Good evening, William," Samantha smiled, accepting his hands. "The unions appreciate transparency. We simply opened the books, showed them the bloated executive compensation we were eliminating, and redirected those funds into their pension plans. It's amazing how reasonable people can be when you treat them with basic financial respect." She said it smoothly, effortlessly, but the razor-sharp implication hung in the air. Richard, unable to contain himself, stepped right into their circle, his face flushed with a mixture of scotch and fury. "Bloated compensation? Is that what we're calling 2 decades of sweat equity now? Tell me, Miss Hayes, do you plan on running the entire eastern seaboard with the same incompetence you use to pour champagne?" The silence that fell over their immediate circle was absolute. William Ashford's eyebrows shot up. David Cole tensed, stepping forward, but Samantha held up a single manicured finger, stopping him instantly. She turned slowly to face Richard. She didn't look angry. She looked at him with the chilling, clinical fascination of a scientist examining a particularly stubborn parasite under a microscope. "Mr. Jason," Samantha said, her voice a soft, silken purr that carried dangerously far in the quieted room. "I was informed you had secured a pity ticket to this event. I must admit, I admire your resilience. Most men would be hiding on their private island by now." "I don't run from a fight," Richard sneered, leaning in. "Especially not from a corporate raider playing dress-up. You got lucky, Samantha. You ambushed me. But you can't buy industry loyalty. Bill and I were just discussing the future, a future that doesn't involve Hayes Whitmore." Samantha tilted her head slightly, her dark eyes locking onto his. "Is that so? Were you pitching him your phantom startup, Richard?" The one you are desperately trying to fund because you are entirely, completely broke. Richard recoiled as if she had slapped him. Broke? I secured a $50 million buyout. I am a very wealthy man. Samantha sighed, a delicate, disappointed sound. She reached into a small, elegant silver clutch she was carrying and pulled out a single, folded sheet of heavy cream paper. You were a wealthy man, Richard, Samantha corrected gently. Until yesterday afternoon, at 4 p.m. She didn't hand the paper to him. She handed it to William Ashford. What is this? Richard demanded, a cold spike of genuine panic finally piercing through his arrogant facade. That, Samantha said, her voice ringing with absolute, unyielding authority, is a copy of a federal injunction. You see, Richard, when you called Bradley Henderson 3 weeks ago and instructed him to orchestrate a wildcat strike, you committed corporate sabotage. When you told him you had buyers lined up, you violated your non-compete clause. And when Bradley Henderson realized the federal authorities were auditing his brother-in-law's auto shop for embezzlement, he panicked. Richard's mouth fell open. He couldn't speak. The air had been sucked from his lungs. Bradley sang like a canary, Richard, Samantha continued, stepping 1 inch closer, backing him down simply by the force of her presence. He handed over his phone logs, your text messages, and a sworn affidavit detailing your conspiracy to artificially deflate the stock price of my company. My legal team filed a breach of contract lawsuit yesterday. A judge has officially frozen all of your assets, including your escrow buyout, your real estate holdings, and the bank accounts tied to your private island in Belize, pending a federal investigation. William Ashford handed the paper back to Samantha, looking at Richard with absolute disgust. You tried to artificially cripple a national supply chain out of petty spite? Good God, Richard. You're not just a dinosaur, you're a liability. Don't ever approach me for capital again. William turned his back entirely on Richard and engaged David Cole in a conversation about maritime shipping lanes, immediately erasing Richard from his reality. Richard stood frozen, his empire completely dissolved into ash. He was broke. He was facing federal charges. The room was spinning. He looked wildly around, seeing the faces of his former peers, his friends, all looking at him with either pity or revulsion. Suddenly, a young waiter carrying a heavy silver tray of champagne flutes bumped into Richard's shoulder in the crowded space. 3 crystal glasses tipped over, shattering on the polished floor, splashing a few drops of cold liquid onto Richard's expensive Italian leather shoes. The young waiter, a kid no older than 20, immediately dropped to his knees, his face pale with terror. "Oh, sir, I am so sorry. Please, I'll clean it up right away." For a split second, the old Richard Jasson surged forward. The bully, the tyrant. He opened his mouth, his face twisting into a mask of pure rage, ready to scream at the boy, ready to demand his termination, ready to belittle someone, anyone, to feel a shred of power again. But before he could utter a single syllable, Samantha Hayes stepped neatly between them. She looked down at the terrified waiter and offered him a warm, genuinely kind smile. "It's perfectly fine. Accidents happen in a crowded room. Take your time, please." Then she turned her dark, devastating eyes back to Richard. The contrast between the warmth she showed the waiter and the glacial, absolute zero void she directed at the former billionaire was breathtaking. "Careful, Richard," Samantha whispered, so quietly only he could hear. "You never know who is holding the tray." She held his gaze for 3 agonizing seconds, ensuring he understood the absolute totality of his ruin. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd of industry titans who parted for her like the Red Sea. Richard Jason was left standing entirely alone in the center of the grand ballroom. He looked down at his ruined shoes, listening to the sound of the young waiter carefully sweeping up the broken glass. For the first time in his arrogant, miserable life, Richard finally understood exactly what he was worth. Nothing. Power is an illusion maintained by volume. True authority requires no amplification. Richard Jason built his life on the belief that worth was defined by the zeros in a bank account and the ability to make others feel small. He weaponized his wealth using a dinner receipt not as a transaction, but as a sword to cut down someone he deemed socially invisible. He forgot the cardinal rule of the modern world. Invisibility is the ultimate camouflage for a predator. Samantha Hayes didn't just buy a company. She executed a masterclass in karmic accounting. She dismantled an empire of arrogance using nothing but patience, a crisp black apron, and the devastating power of the written word. In the end, the man who refused to leave a tip was left completely bankrupt, financially, professionally, and morally. He learned, far too late, that the people serving the table often owned the entire building,